The morning of June 19, 1944 arrived with the kind of clarity that makes momentous events feel almost ordinary. Across the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea, two great fleets were about to collide in what would become the most decisive carrier engagement in naval history. What unfolded that day would forever change the trajectory of the Pacific War, though few realized it in those early moments before the first fighter took to the sky. The American force under Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher represented an unprecedented concentration of naval power. Mitscher himself had been flying aircraft since 1915, making him one of the Navy's pioneering aviators. His flagship, the USS Lexington, served as the command center for Task Force 58, which had departed Majuro Harbor in the Marshall Islands on June 6. The sortie had taken 5 full hours just to clear the harbor. Such was the magnitude of the assembled armada. 15 fast carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers stretched across miles of open ocean, carrying 956 aircraft into battle. Of those aircraft, 475 were F6F Hellcats, a fighter that would prove to be the decisive weapon of the coming engagement. The force was organized into 4 independent task groups, each capable of operating autonomously. Task Group 58.1, under Rear Admiral Joel Jocko Clark, sailed from the USS Hornet, accompanied by the Yorktown, Belleau Wood, and Bataan. Task Group 58.2, commanded by Rear Admiral Alfred E. Montgomery from the USS Bunker Hill, included the Wasp, Monterey, and Cabot. Rear Admiral James W. Reeves commanded Task Group 58-3 from the USS Enterprise, with the Lexington, Princeton, and San Jacinto in company. Finally, Task Group 58-4 under Rear Admiral William K. Caw. Harrell operated from the USS Essex with the Langley and Cowpens. This massive concentration of American naval might have been organized to support the landings on Saipan and to engage the Japanese fleet if it chose to fight. Opposing this armada was Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Japanese First Mobile Fleet, which could muster 9 carriers and approximately 430 aircraft. Ozawa's flagship was the newest Japanese carrier, the Taiho. Alongside her sailed veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Shokaku and Zuikaku, plus the carriers Junyo, Hyo, Ryuho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. The numerical disadvantage, however, masked an even more troubling reality. Many of Ozawa's pilots were replacements with minimal training. Some had accumulated barely 50 hours of flight time in their entire lives. Others had never even fired their weapons during practice, thanks to ammunition shortages that plagued the Japanese war effort. These inexperienced aviators would face American pilots who averaged between 300 and 400 hours of training, including extensive gunnery practice and numerous carrier qualifications. The campaign had begun on June 11th when Task Force 58 launched its assault on the Mariana Islands. Fighter sweeps and bombing raids descended on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in coordinated waves. The Japanese had anticipated that American operations would target the Carolines next, leaving the Marianas defended by only 50 land-based aircraft. In the opening fighter sweep alone, 208 Hellcats claimed 86 Japanese aircraft destroyed. The systematic destruction of Japanese air power in the region had commenced with overwhelming American superiority already apparent. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15 from the USS Essex, participated in these preliminary strikes. McCampbell was a 34-year-old native of Alabama who had initially struggled with gunnery qualification, unable to pass on his first attempts. His pilots, recognizing his potential despite his technical shortcomings, had secretly painted their bullets the same color as his during qualification trials to help him succeed. Now, as he led his squadrons in combat, McCampbell was about to become the Navy's leading ace, a distinction he would hold for the remainder of the war. On June 15th, American forces landed on Saipan. Admiral Somu Toyoda, commanding the Japanese combined fleet, immediately activated Operation Ago, which represented Japan's last realistic hope for achieving the decisive naval battle they had sought since their defeat at Midway 2 years earlier. Every available ship and aircraft was committed to the operation. The Japanese plan depended on coordinating Ozawa's carrier aircraft with land-based planes operating from Guam and Tinian. Japanese aircraft possessed longer range than their American counterparts, allowing them to strike from distances beyond which American planes could reach, land on Guam to refuel and rearm, and then strike again. The strategic advantage seemed to rest with the Japanese, at least on paper. But the Americans possessed advantages that Ozawa failed to fully appreciate or understand. Task Force 58's radar systems could detect incoming aircraft at distances up to 150 miles, providing 30 to 40 minutes of warning before enemy aircraft arrived. Fighter directors stationed in the combat information centers of each carrier could use this radar data to vector Hellcats to perfect intercept positions. Furthermore, the Americans possessed proximity, fused anti-aircraft shells, still classified as top secret, that would devastate any aircraft penetrating the fighter screen. Most critically, the F6F Hellcat had been specifically designed with the Zero in mind. Every aspect of its design reflected lessons learned from earlier encounters with Japanese fighters. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrackiw, already credited with 12 victories, represented the emerging generation of American naval aviators. Vrackiw had spent months as a wingman to Edward Butch O'Hare, the Navy's first ace, absorbing combat lessons that would serve him well. Now flying with VF-16 from the Lexington, Vrackiw prepared for what would become the most spectacular day of his combat career. In the ready room before dawn, he checked his plotting board and equipment, mentally reviewing the tactics and procedures that might keep him alive. At 0745 hours, the submarine USS Albacore, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard, fired 6 torpedoes at Ozawa's flagship Taiho. Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, piloting an aircraft above, observed the torpedo wakes cutting through the water. Without hesitation, he deliberately crashed his aircraft into one of the torpedoes, sacrificing his life to save the ship. His heroic action destroyed one torpedo, but another struck the Taiho's forward elevator pit. The damage appeared superficial at first, but ruptured fuel lines began releasing dangerous vapors throughout the vessel. An inexperienced damage control officer made a catastrophic decision, opening the ventilation system to clear the fumes. Instead of solving the problem, this action distributed the vapors throughout the ship's interior. At 15:32 hours, the Taiho would be consumed by a massive explosion and sink, taking 1,650 men to the bottom. At 08,030, radar operators across Task Force 58 began detecting the first Japanese strike wave. 69 aircraft had been launched from Ozawa's carriers at maximum range. American fighter directors immediately began their work, their calm, professional voices crackling over radial frequencies. Fighter directors could see the entire developing battle on their radar scopes, possessing a godlike view of the engagement that their Japanese counterparts could never match. The Japanese relied on visual detection, typically spotting American fighters only when the Hellcats were already in firing position. Commander Charles Brewer, leading VF-15 from the Essex, was among the first to spot the incoming raid. His calm report of the enemy position triggered a coordinated response. Hellcats already airborne climbed for altitude advantage. Those still on the flight decks were scrambled in rapid succession. The professional killing machine that was American naval aviation swung into action with practiced efficiency. Lieutenant Commander Paul Buell, commanding VF-16, would later describe the interception with stark simplicity. The Japanese pilots maintained tight formation, flying straight and level toward their targets as if on a training flight. It was their first and fatal mistake. American pilots couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The Japanese held formation while being systematically shot to pieces, never attempting evasive maneuvers. Commander McCampbell led 12 Hellcats from VF-15 at 25,000 feet when he spotted the enemy formation below. In his own words, he made a modified high-side run, though his starboard guns initially malfunctioned, throwing him into a violent skid. After correcting the problem, he pursued a duty dive bomber that had pushed over and gained speed in a desperate escape attempt. McCampbell's Hellcat proved faster. His 6 guns converged at the perfect distance, and the Judy exploded. McCampbell would destroy 5 Judy dive bombers during the morning engagement, then add 2 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters to his tally that afternoon over Guam, achieving 7 victories in a single day. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, would later achieve distinction during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October. Meanwhile, Vrasiu faced an unexpected problem. His F6F supercharger had malfunctioned, severely limiting both his altitude and speed capabilities. Unable to maintain position with his squadron, he led his division back toward the task force. As they approached, Vrasiu spotted a massive formation of Judy dive bombers bearing down on the American ships. What followed became legend in naval aviation circles. Vrasiu would later recall the scene with vivid imagery. The enemy aircraft were so densely packed against the water below that he felt like a child confronted with a plate of cookies, afraid someone else would claim some, even though he had all he could handle. In just 8 minutes of combat, expending only 360 rounds of ammunition, approximately 10 rounds per gun per kill, Vrasiu destroyed 6 Judy dive bombers with nearly perfect marksmanship. After landing back on the Lexington, still wearing his flight gear, Vrasiu held up 6 fingers for the photographers. That single image would become iconic, the grinning young ace symbolizing American air superiority. When he inspected his aircraft afterward, he made a startling discovery. The wing fold pins were protruding slightly. He had flown the greatest mission of his career with his wings only partially secured, a realization that chilled him when he understood the danger he had unknowingly courted. The first Japanese wave was being annihilated. Of 69 aircraft launched, 42 were shot down. The few survivors who managed to return to their carriers reported scenes of horror. Hellcats appearing from above, from the sides, always possessing superior speed and firepower. The American fighters seemed to be everywhere at once, controlled by an invisible hand that positioned them perfectly for each intercept. The second wave, consisting of 128 aircraft, launched at A900 and encountered an even worse fate. By this point, every Hellcat in Task Force 58 was either airborne or positioned on a flight deck ready for immediate launch. The fighter directors possessed perfect radar plots of the incoming raid and positioned the American fighters at optimal intercept altitudes. The Japanese flew directly into a carefully orchestrated wall of Hellcats. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia of VF-9, flying from the USS Yorktown, had developed what he termed the mowing machine tactic. Working with 3 other pilots, James French, Clinton Smith, and Harris Mitchell, Valencia had created what may have been the deadliest division in naval aviation history. This 4-man team would eventually claim 50 victories between them, though on June 19th they participated in the larger defensive effort. Fighting Squadron 1 from the Yorktown had a particularly spectacular day under the command of Commander Oscar Smoke Stren. VF-1 claimed 37 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Lieutenant Junior Grade George Carr alone shot down 5 aircraft, achieving ace status in a single day. The squadron's Hellcats dove from 24,000 feet into masses of Japanese aircraft positioned 10,000 feet below, their machine guns blazing with devastating effect. The technical superiority of the Hellcat over the Zero was overwhelming and fundamental. The Zero, when fully loaded, weighed 5,313 pounds. The Hellcat weighed 12,598 pounds. That additional weight consisted of armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural reinforcement that made the American fighter vastly more survivable. The Zero's pilot sat behind a thin aluminum panel with minimal protection. The Hellcat's pilot was protected by armor plate behind and below with bulletproof glass in front. A single incendiary bullet would ignite the Zero's fuel tanks, causing a catastrophic explosion. The Hellcat's fuel tanks were lined with layers of rubber that swelled when punctured, sealing the hole automatically. The engine differential was equally decisive. The F6F3's Pratt & Whitney R28-8-28-10 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, with water injection boosting output to 2,200 horsepower for combat emergency power. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai 21 engine managed only 1,130 horsepower. This vast difference meant the Hellcat could outclimb, outdiv, and outrun the Zero at any altitude. At 20,000 feet, where much of the combat occurred, the Hellcat could climb at 2,000 feet per minute. The Zero managed perhaps 1,500 feet per minute, and that rate decreased rapidly as altitude increased. The armament comparison was equally stark. The Hellcat carried 6.5 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each with 400 rounds, for a total of 2,400 rounds. These guns were bore-sighted to converge at a specific range, creating a cone of destruction where all 6 streams of bullets met. A 2-second burst placed 200 rounds into an area only 6 feet in diameter. Nothing could survive such concentrated firepower. The Zero typically carried 2 Type 99 20mm cannons with only 60 rounds each, plus 2 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns. While the 20mm cannon was more powerful per round, the severely limited ammunition meant Zero pilots had to conserve their shooting, carefully calculating each burst. Hellcat pilots could fire long, sustained bursts, walking their tracers onto target with impunity. At 1,000 hours, the third wave of 47 aircraft approached from Ozawa's carrier division, operating from the Junyo, Hiyo, and Ryuho. These aircraft immediately became lost, failing to track American movements accurately. Only 7 would return to their carriers. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a Pearl Harbor veteran flying from the Junyo, was among the few experienced pilots in this wave. After being forced to crash land on Rota Island when his fuel was exhausted, he examined his aircraft and exclaimed in astonishment, "I never saw so many Grummons." His aircraft was riddled with bullet holes from multiple encounters with American fighters. Commander James Jig Dog Ramage, leading Bombing Squadron 10 from the Enterprise, observed the fighter pilot's work with professional admiration. He later recalled that the American fighters really had a field day. The Japanese came in perfect formations, and our boys just cut them to pieces. It was like watching a training exercise, except the targets were real. The Japanese pilots' adherence to tight formation proved catastrophic. Formation flying offered protection against fighters equipped with guns firing from multiple angles, but it made the formation itself an easy target for concentrated fire. The fourth wave of 82 aircraft launched at 1,100 hours and met the same devastating fate. American pilots were beginning to feel something approaching sympathy for their opponents. Ensign William Spider Webb of VF2 later reflected on the experience. "They were so green. They held formation while being shot at. They didn't even try evasive maneuvers. It was both impressive and heartbreaking to watch such brave men fly to certain death." Not all American pilots survived the day unscathed. Commander Charles Brewer of VF-15, after shooting down 3 enemy aircraft, was himself shot down and killed over Guam. His loss served as a sobering reminder that even in what was becoming known as a turkey shoot, war extracted its price. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley took command of the F-15 following Brewer's death, continuing the squadron's devastating effectiveness throughout the remainder of the engagement. At 11,020 hours, the submarine USS Kavala, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler, fired 6 torpedoes at the carrier Shokaku. The submarine had maneuvered into a perfect firing position and 3 torpedoes struck home. The Shokaku, a Pearl Harbor veteran displacing 32,100 tons when fully loaded, went down with heavy loss of life. 2 of Japan's newest and largest carriers had now been lost in a single day. The radar advantage possessed by the Americans cannot be overstated in any analysis of the battle's outcome. The SK and SK-2 radar systems could detect aircraft at 150 miles, providing 30 to 40 minutes of warning before incoming raids arrived. The Japanese possessed only visual detection, typically spotting American fighters when the Hellcats were already in firing position, rendering any defense nearly impossible. Lieutenant Joseph Edgar, serving as fighter director aboard the Lexington, was credited with vectoring fighters to intercept 35 enemy aircraft. He could see the entire battle developing on his radar scope like a chess master viewing the complete board while his opponent could see only individual pieces. The fighter direction system itself represented a revolutionary advancement in naval warfare. Each carrier's combat information center was a darkened room filled with radar scopes, plotting boards, and radio equipment. Trained fighter directors could track multiple raids simultaneously, vector fighters to perfect intercept positions, warn of approaching threats, and coordinate the entire defensive effort. They maintained calm, measured tones, even as dozens of enemy aircraft approached their assigned targets. Their communications were clear and professional. Vector 270, Angels 20, bandits approaching. Investigate and report. Lieutenant Commander William R. Killer. Kane, commanding Air Group 10 from the Enterprise, flew combat missions on both June 19th and 20th. In his personal diary, he wrote of witnessing the greatest air defeat suffered by any nation ever. Kane had started the war flying obsolete aircraft against superior Japanese pilots in the desperate early months of the Pacific conflict. Now he commanded squadrons equipped with the finest fighter in the world, flown by superbly trained pilots and directed by radar controllers who could see everything developing across the battlefield. The American training system represented perhaps the greatest advantage of all. By June 1944, new pilots arriving at operational squadrons had accumulated 300 to 400 hours of flight time. They had practiced carrier landings dozens of times on converted Great Lakes paddle wheelers. They had fired thousands of rounds in gunnery practice. They knew their aircraft intimately in every operational detail. In stark contrast, Japanese pilot training had completely collapsed. Where Japan had once produced highly skilled pilots with 500 or more hours of training, by 1944, the Empire was sending boys into combat with 50 to 100 hours total flight time. The American rotation system multiplied these advantages. Experienced pilots like Lieutenant Commander John S. E. Jimmy Thatch, inventor of the Thatch defensive weave tactic, were rotated home to train new pilots. Their combat experience was institutionalized and taught to every new pilot entering operational squadrons. The Japanese, conversely, kept their experienced pilots in combat until they died. By June 1944, almost all the Pearl Harbor and Midway veterans were dead. The few survivors, like Zenji Abe, were overwhelmed trying to lead inexperienced pilots against superior American forces, better equipment, and overwhelming numbers. The communications advantage was equally crucial to American success. American pilots possessed reliable VHF radios using standardized terminology. They could coordinate attacks, warn of threats, and maintain situational awareness throughout complex engagements. A pilot could call out a warning, "Brake right, Hellcat 0 on your 6." His wingman would respond, "Roger, braking right." Thanks, led. Japanese radios were notoriously unreliable. Many pilots flew without them entirely to save weight, relying instead on hand signals that were impossible to see in the chaos of combat. By noon on June 19th, the first phase of the battle had concluded. The Japanese had launched 373 carrier aircraft in 4 separate waves. Approximately 346 carrier aircraft had been shot down on June 19th alone. American losses totaled 33 aircraft and 26 flight personnel, with most losses attributed to operational accidents rather than combat encounters. The ocean surrounding Task Force 58 was littered with burning wreckage, oil slicks, and Japanese pilots clinging to life rafts in the warm Pacific water. Admiral Mitscher, observing the carnage from the Lexington's flag bridge, turned to his staff and delivered a simple assessment. "The Japanese carrier air force has been destroyed. They'll never recover from this." His analysis proved absolutely correct. Japan had lost not merely aircraft that could eventually be replaced, but irreplaceable, trained pilots who could not be regenerated in the time remaining to the empire. The afternoon brought continued action over Guam and Rota as American fighters caught Japanese aircraft attempting to land and refuel. The F-116's pilots, including Vrasiu, flew multiple sorties, adding significantly to their victory tallies. The total Japanese losses for the day would eventually reach approximately 480 aircraft when including land-based planes destroyed in the islands. The American maintenance crews performed miracles of organization and efficiency. Damaged Hellcats were repaired overnight, ready to fly additional combat missions the next morning. The American logistics system delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts in quantities that seemed almost limitless to Japanese observers. Each carrier possessed machine shops capable of manufacturing replacement parts. Damaged engines were swapped out in hours. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled desperately to keep their remaining aircraft operational, cannibalizing damaged planes for parts and improvising repairs with whatever materials remained available. As the sun descended on June 19th, Admiral Ozawa still harbored hopes that he might salvage something from the disaster. He possessed no accurate conception of the scale of his losses. Returning pilots reported shooting down hundreds of American aircraft in their excited, desperate reports. In reality, they had shot down almost none. The few Japanese pilots who survived the day were exhausted, demoralized, and traumatized by the overwhelming nature of their defeat. June 20th brought the second phase of the battle, the American counterstrike. Search aircraft had been seeking the Japanese fleet throughout the day. At 15:40 hours, Lieutenant Robert Nelson, flying from the Enterprise, finally located them 275 miles west of Task Force 58. It was extreme range for American aircraft, and launching so late meant most pilots would return after darkness fell. But Mitscher made his decision without hesitation: launch them. At 16:24 hours, Task Force 58 began launching 216 aircraft, 85 Hellcats, 77 dive bombers, and 54 torpedo bombers. Every pilot understood the risks involved. They would be flying to the absolute limit of their aircraft's range. Many would not have sufficient fuel to return to their carriers, but the opportunity to finish off the Japanese fleet was too tempting to pass up. Lieutenant Commander James Ramage led VB-10's Dauntlesses from the Enterprise. As they approached the Japanese fleet, he could see 3 carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers spread across miles of ocean. The few remaining Japanese fighters rose to intercept, but they were overwhelmed by the escorting Hellcats. The American attack was somewhat confused, but nonetheless effective. The carrier Hio, took several bomb and torpedo hits and sank. The Zuikaku was heavily damaged, as were the carriers Junyo and Chiyoda. The battleship Haruna took a bomb hit and 2 oilers were sunk. The real drama of the day unfolded during the return flight. As darkness fell, American aircraft began running desperately low on fuel, the radio filled with increasingly desperate communications. "This is Blue 7, engine quit, going in. Red 3 ditching, send help." Pilots watched their fuel gauges drop toward empty, calculating desperately whether they possessed sufficient reserves to reach their carriers. Admiral Mitscher made one of the most famous decisions of the entire Pacific War. Despite the submarine threat posed by Japanese vessels in the area, he ordered, "Turn on the lights." Every ship in Task Force 58 illuminated its positions. Searchlights pointed skyward, flight deck lights blazed with brilliant intensity, and star shells were fired into the air to illuminate the fleet's location. It was like Times Square transplanted to the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander John Gray of VF-18 later described the scene with emotion barely contained. "I was down to fumes when I saw those lights. It was the most beautiful sight of my life. I didn't care which carrier, I just needed a deck." He landed on the Yorktown instead of his assigned Hornet, but the flight deck crew received him like he belonged there. The recovery operation was chaotic and dangerous. Planes landed on any available flight deck. Some crashed during landing, blocking decks and creating additional hazards. Others ditched alongside ships in the water. Destroyers picked up pilots from the ocean. Of the 216 aircraft launched, 80 were lost, but most of the pilots were rescued through this coordinated effort. The human cost was 49 aircrew killed or missing, still far less than the Japanese had lost in pilots from just one carrier. Commander Kane wrote in his diary, "Mitscher took a hell of a risk lighting up the fleet, but he saved a lot of good men. That's the kind of leader men will follow anywhere." The Admiral's willingness to accept the submarine risk to save his pilots created a bond between leadership and those under command that would endure for the remainder of the war. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had concluded. In 2 days of intensive combat, the Japanese had lost approximately 600 aircraft, 3 carriers, and 2 oilers. More significantly, they had lost nearly all their remaining trained carrier pilots. American losses totaled 123 aircraft, with most losses resulting from fuel exhaustion on June 20th rather than combat encounters. The disparity in pilot losses was particularly telling. Japan had lost experienced aviators who could not be replaced, while America had rescued most of its pilots through aggressive search and rescue operations. The technical specifications that made the Hellcat dominant tell the complete story of American technological superiority. The F6F, the main production variant during the Philippine Sea engagement, possessed a wingspan of 42 feet 10 inches and a length of 33 feet 7 inches. Its empty weight of 9,238 pounds included substantial armor plating around the cockpit, oil cooler, and oil tank. The self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb multiple hits and continue functioning. The bulletproof windscreen could stop 20mm cannon shells. The R-2800-110 engine represented a masterpiece of American engineering. With water injection capability, it could produce 2,200 horsepower for combat emergency power. The engine demonstrated incredible reliability. Many Hellcats returned from combat with cylinders shot away and still running at full power. The 3-bladed Hamilton standard propeller was perfectly matched to the engine, providing excellent climb performance and rapid acceleration. The armament installation had been carefully designed for maximum effectiveness. The 6 guns were staggered to prevent interference, with 400 rounds per gun fed from ammunition boxes in the wings. The guns were harmonized to converge at 300 yards, creating a pattern approximately 6 feet in diameter, where all 6 streams of bullets intersected. A 2-second burst placed 200 rounds into that concentrated area. No aircraft could survive such concentrated firepower. The cockpit design reflected the demands of modern air combat. The pilot sat high with excellent visibility in all directions. The controls were well placed and instinctive. The gun sight was a reflector type, projecting an aiming reticle onto a glass plate in front of the pilot's eyes. Unlike the Zero, which required constant adjustment of controls to maintain trim, the Hellcat was stable and flew almost hands-off, allowing the pilot to concentrate on the tactical situation. Production quality was consistent across all Hellcats manufactured. Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats between 1942 and 1945, with peak production reaching 500 aircraft per month. Every aircraft was identical with completely interchangeable parts. A Hellcat built in 1943 used exactly the same components as one built in 1945. This standardization made maintenance simple and efficient, allowing damaged aircraft to be repaired quickly using readily available replacement parts. The Zero, by contrast, was still partially hand-built in 1944. Each aircraft was slightly different from the others. Quality was declining as Japan ran short of materials and experienced workers had been drafted into military service. The fuel situation illustrated the broader industrial problem confronting Japan. American carriers used 100-octane aviation fuel, specially refined for maximum performance and engine reliability. The Japanese were reduced to 87-octane fuel, reducing engine power and increasing mechanical failures. American pilots could push their engines to combat power without concern. Japanese pilots risked catastrophic engine failure if they demanded too much from their worn, poorly maintained engines. The logistics chain supporting the Hellcat was enormous and sophisticated. Fleet oilers brought millions of gallons of fuel to forward areas. Supply ships delivered spare parts by the ton. Escort carriers fed replacement aircraft to combat squadrons. Mobile service squadrons could perform depot-level maintenance at forward bases, keeping damaged aircraft in service. It was industrial warfare on a scale the Japanese could not match or even comprehend. The human factor remained decisive in determining the outcome. American pilots knew they were flying the best fighter in the world. They had confidence in their training, their aircraft, and their leadership. If shot down, they knew massive rescue efforts would be mounted to save them. Japanese pilots knew they were flying inferior aircraft with minimal training against a superior enemy equipped with better technology and superior numbers. Being shot down meant either death in the water or capture. The psychological impact of the turkey shoot was devastating. Survivors spread word of the Hellcat's apparent invincibility throughout Japanese naval aviation. Morale plummeted precipitously. Many pilots began viewing future missions as suicide runs, even before the formal adoption of kamikaze tactics months later. Post-war analysis confirmed that American claims were actually conservative in their accounting. Japanese records revealed that American losses were sometimes lower than reported. In many cases, Japanese losses were higher than initially claimed. The kill ratio of 19-1 wasn't propaganda or exaggeration. It was documented fact from the records of both nations. The Hellcat continued its dominance throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. On October 4, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Commander McCampbell shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single mission, establishing a United States Navy record. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, shot down 6 additional aircraft. 2 pilots had shot down 15 aircraft between them, more than many squadrons managed in a single day during the war's earlier phases. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, Hellcats had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, while losing only 270 to enemy aircraft. That incredible 19-to-1 ratio demonstrated the overwhelming superiority of the aircraft and the training of American pilots. They flew 66,530 combat sorties, dropped 6,530 tons of bombs, and established American air superiority wherever they operated throughout the Pacific theater. The design philosophy behind the Hellcat influenced all subsequent American fighters. The emphasis on pilot protection, heavy firepower, and robust construction became standard in American fighter design. The Hellcat proved conclusively that in modern warfare, the side possessing better technology, superior training, and greater industrial capacity would prevail. Looking back across the decades, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than a battle. It represented vindication of the American approach to warfare. While the Japanese clung to concepts of individual warrior spirit and lightweight, highly maneuverable aircraft, the Americans had embraced industrial warfare as a comprehensive national strategy. The Hellcat was the perfect expression of this philosophy, tough, powerful, and available in overwhelming numbers. Admiral Ozawa survived the war and later reflected on the battle's historical significance, acknowledging that the Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the definitive end of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. The American Hellcat, combined with superior pilot training and industrial capacity, had proven decisive in achieving victory. Commander David McCampbell, who ended the war with 34 victories, all achieved while flying Hellcats, put the aircraft's significance into simple, direct language. "The Hellcat was an honest airplane," he stated. "It did exactly what you asked it to do. It brought you home. In combat, that's all that matters." As the sun set on June 19, 1944, Japanese naval aviation was finished as an effective military force. The survivors, limping back to their carriers in the gathering darkness, understood they had encountered their master in the F6F Hellcat. The dark blue fighter bearing the white star had ended forever the myth of Japanese air superiority. In a single day, American industry, training, and technology had triumphed over Japanese courage and warrior spirit. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot represented more than a battle. It demonstrated American air supremacy delivered through the lethal superiority of the F6F Hellcat.